In 1998, the world saw one of the most controversial video games so far, an RPG that will challenge the player's mind with a saturation of psychology and philosophical ideas. So today we are going to look into 10 things you may not know about Xenogears. Number 10. Project Noah. It is widely known nowadays that Xenogears was going to be the original Final Fantasy VII. We all know already that Squaresoft deemed the project too dark and religious for it to be under the Final Fantasy banner. Another piece of information most people are already acquainted with is that before that, Xenogears was proposed as a Chrono Trigger sequel. Once again though, Squaresoft said no. What most people don't know is one of the main reasons why this game was rejected 2 times in a row. In reality, Xenogears was going to be much darker than the final product we saw. The script of Project Noah was heavily influenced by the works of Nietzsche, Jung, and Freud. Direct conflict, questioning, and even attacking on both the Catholic and Christian religion were set as the basis of the story. Correlation, even to a certain sexual extent, between man and machine was also quite present, and since it was embracing overly complicated psychological ideas, hard to understand, turning all of that into a Japanese role-playing game seemed pretty much deranged. Due to the highly controversial nature of the project, Squaresoft rejected Takahashi's proposals, censored him, but still allowed him to develop Xenogears as its own game. However, these came with certain restrictions that hurt the final release badly. Number 9. The real reason behind its rushed development. Again, another piece of information everyone knows already is the fact that the second disc of Xenogears was rushed. In fact, it's accurate to say the entire development of the whole game was rushed. It's not only due to the fact that Squaresoft and Takahashi weren't exactly on good terms anymore. I mean, he had worked as an art director for Final Fantasy IV, 5, and 6, but when he came to propose his original and mind-blowing ideas to the company, they told him to go F himself. So Xenogears, originally known as Project Noah, was a video game that suffered through development hell in all sense of the word. With a very limited budget, Takahashi and his wife Kaori Tanaka, also known as Soraya Saga, had to cut their long and overly extensive story into half. Reducing the plot also led to reducing the gameplay, and there wasn't enough space to do both on the second disc, which led Takahashi and producer Hiromichi Tanaka to give priority to the highlights of the script and throw everything they could into the second disc. All this just because Squaresoft didn't really believe in the project. Nevertheless, despite all of this, Xenogears was a commercial success, but only in Japan and North America. Number 8. Banned from Europe. Because of its controversial nature, Xenogears barely made it to North America. After being released in Japan, to critical acclaim as a matter of fact, Squaresoft still believed it wasn't a good idea to localize it. Translator Richard Honeywood was in charge of the translation, and he also went through hell, first because of the complicated transition between Japanese to English, second because of the game's religious questioning, which could offend a lot of North Americans, and third because a lot of his staff just kept quitting in the middle of the translation, saying it was just too hard. Upon noticing this, Sony didn't even bother localizing the game to Europe, even though it had also been a commercial breakthrough in North America. But the other main reason was precisely because they thought the game was going to be too offensive for the pure and innocent European minds. The ESRB still gave it a teen rating despite its mature content included, but PEGI didn't even bother with it and rejected the game, or more like they pretended to reject it, as Sony didn't really have a lot of interest in releasing Squaresoft RPGs in Europe due to the lack of potential sales within the genre. A similar situation happened that very same year in 1998, with another one of Squaresoft's titles, Parasite Eve, but that's a story for another time. Honestly, I think banning the game was just an excuse not to work on the complexity of the script, and there isn't even accurate information on this matter. I found a few websites claiming Sony finally answered why Xenogears wasn't released in Europe, but the links were all mysteriously dead. To date, Xenogears hasn't seen an official European release. Some years later, an even more controversial RPG was released in all 3 territories, and no one blinked an eye. Oh, the irony. Number 7. Xenobeasts. So since Xenogears was first going to be a sequel to Chrono Trigger and then Final Fantasy VII, some things in the game had to be changed at the end. One of the original ideas was that instead of having mechs, or gears in this case, there were going to be summons, as in summon beasts, like the ones in the Final Fantasy series. Just imagine playing those turn-based battles with Shiva, Bahamut and Ifrit instead of the actual Xenogears. As a matter of fact, most of the science fiction elements of the game were added after it was rejected as a Chrono Trigger sequel. It just amazes me to even think that this game could have been something outrageously different. Imagine Xenogears being only a medieval fantasy game, or perhaps one just with steampunk elements like some of the Final Fantasy titles. I'm glad this project ended up becoming its own game, something Hironobu Sakaguchi himself told to Takahashi, as he was one of the very few people who saw the game's true potential. Number 6. Trivia and Changes. That wasn't the only change the developers made. After both proposals for the aforementioned games were rejected, Squaresoft kept pushing on for changes. I'll give you a few examples. According to an interview I found, there was going to be a bathhouse and even a changing room, including an event sequence taking place there. Yasuyuki Hone, artist of the game, wanted to make nude sprites for everyone, but Squaresoft gave him the middle finger. Battle system was going to resemble more a fighting game than anything, which is the reason why it often feels a little bit like one. Producer Hiromichi Tanaka didn't want to do the classic menu-based system, but then he realized the combat resembling a fighting game wouldn't be very fun, and it would have been too hard to do for the gears. Plus, low budget impeded working around on ideas for it, so they ended up going for a classic turn-based RPG, but with combos included to resemble fighters in some way. Other interesting trivia are there in this interview, like Citan being initially a war strategist instead of a doctor, Margie being a party member, etc. I'll leave a link to it in the description below. But the point is, with so many changes, proposal rejections, time constraints, and a difference of ideas, it's no surprise Xenogears turned out to be something completely different from its original concept. It's also no surprise on why Takahashi left Squaresoft right after its release. Number 6. And then Monolith Soft was founded. In 1999, Takahashi and several other staff members of Xenogears rebelled against Squaresoft and quit. Takahashi and his wife had been so caught up, deeply in love with the game, that they wanted to make a sequel happen. Alas, they couldn't do it. Squaresoft had kept the rights to the name and their characters, which means neither a direct sequel or even a prequel could be possible without their involvement. Takahashi founded Monolith Soft with the help of Masaya Nakamura, the founder of Namco. Once again, sadly, Takahashi was under the strings of somebody else. But on a whim, along with his wife, a new project was born, Xenosaga. Neither a sequel or a prequel to Xenogears, Xenosaga was still somewhat connected to the game. However, they had to be very careful not to be too obvious, since that could have triggered a few copyright claims from Squaresoft, now being Square Enix. But the real sequel to Xenogears? There were actually plans for one, but we'll get to that later. Monolith Soft will go on to achieve critical acclaim as a developer, especially with their overly successful series Xenoblade Chronicles. Yeah, I'd say it was a great decision leaving Square Enix behind. Number 4. Music. The soundtrack for Xenogears was handled by legendary composer Yasunori Mitsuda. He joined the team mainly because of Masato Kato, the original scriptwriter of Chrono Trigger. After having worked with him for so long, specifically in Trigger, Yasunori really wanted to join the project as well. Kato helped Takahashi and Kaori to write the scenario for Xenogears. Mitsuda fell in love with their ideas, so he wanted to create music for their story. The result was a combination of Celtic and ethnic music to give a mysterious religion theme to the game, an orchestra to back up its deep plot. It also led to the very first vocal track for an ending theme in a Squaresoft RPG. My Village is number 1. The Lahan theme village was the very first music track Mitsuda composed, hence its name. But that's because he already had a good preconception of the village. Truth is, half of the time, because part of the script was being written at the same time as his music, he was composing blind. He had a few ideas of this and that, but nothing really concrete on certain areas or events. It's so amazing this genius managed to create such an incredible soundtrack without even knowing half of the time what was going on. He became so committed to it, he practically moved into the studio and barely went home. So difficult was to compose music for Xenogears that he ended up in a hospital once, saying he almost never slept because sleeping was just a waste of valuable time. Number 3. Why was the camera so bad? When most fans remember their playthrough on Xenogears, one usual complaint is shared among all. The camera is terrible, especially in certain areas. Low budget was one of the reasons for many of the game's flaws, we've already established that. But then there's the fact that it was basically the first time the player could control the camera directly with the trigger buttons in a Squaresoft game. Producer Hiromichi Tanaka was in charge of this new feature. He had previously worked on Trials of Mana, where no manual camera had been involved. Tired of working on games with multiple storylines and protagonists intertwined, he joined Xenogears with this challenge in mind. His idea was to focus on one character alone, while giving the player the feel of being in control of the view. The camera controls were also made with the same purpose, to make the player feel the full 3D impact of the mighty PlayStation. But because of time restraints, low budget and very young programmers in the staff, not a lot of attention went into this. The result was players getting confused, lost and often frustrated. Number 2. Censorship and the Elly controversy. Because this is a spoiler-free video, I can't exactly explain why Elly's sexualization was partially justified. One thing I can say, however, is how the entire process of her design led to some small censorship from even Squaresoft themselves. Main character design was done by artist Kunihiko Tanaka. Takahashi told him he wanted Elly with long, beautiful, straight hair, as if resembling the Eve from the Bible. For her clothes, however, he told Tanaka he wanted her to look like a race queen, particularly on her uniform, and that she needed to wear something that showed her curves. To make an emphasis on her design and to be able to make perfect sense with her role in the overall plot, Takahashi also needed nude drawings of her. But when it came to certain anime cutscenes in the game where Elly needs to show up nude, Sony intervened. According to producer Hiromichi Tanaka, a nude woman was considered a no-go for the PlayStation, so he personally changed a few parts of the scene to avoid showing Elly's breasts as much as possible. Other nudity, blood, and strong religious themes were totally alright, I guess, and the game still got a teen rating by the ESRB. So contrary to what some RPGs have suffered in the past in terms of censorship over the past decades, Xenogears was barely censored, almost left intact, except for that Elly scene. I guess showing up nipples was probably going to offend a lot of people out there, even in Japan. Number 1. Sequel. Takahashi and his wife Kaori stated at the end of the 90s that they had planned a direct sequel for Xenogears. Original plans were vague, but they did have some small ideas here and there. Continuing the story with the same characters would have been hard, but nonetheless they had a few roles in mind. Ironically though, Squaresoft had almost forced the team to make what was supposed to be Disc 2 as the sequel. They gave the team 1.5 years to complete the game. Eventually, this was extended to 2 years. Because a big part of the staff was young and inexperienced, completing the full story in 2 discs in 2 years was pretty much impossible. So Squaresoft thought the second part of the game should actually be the sequel. We all know Takahashi decided against this. Fully aware of the damage he would cause, he rushed the story into Disc 2. The question is why? What was wrong with a direct sequel of Xenogears where Disc 2 could have become its own full RPG? It's very simple. It was a lie. Takahashi realized it would never happen, so he did us a favor by trying to release as much possible of his story, even if it was rushed. He also realized that a brand new sequel was also going to be impossible, especially since all the money and attention and budget and everything was going to the Final Fantasy movie, The Spirits Within, which was a commercial failure. This was the last straw for Takahashi, and that's a huge part of the reason why he left the company the following year. Xenogears is a legendary game, rushed or not. It was a commercial success, it became a cult classic, and it is considered as one of the best RPGs ever made on the PlayStation. To be able to achieve all of that, even rushed, speaks volumes. Whether we'll see someday a remake, remaster, any kind of port, or even a sequel, doesn't change the fact that Xenogears made history as one of the most influential RPGs of all time.